Hi there, I'm Spencer Campbell of Gila RPGs, and this is a short video that's just sort of demonstrating what is new in REAP. So this video is specifically designed for people who are familiar with RUNE, my previous solo TTRPG, and they want to know what has been added or changed in REAP. Or if you're just kind of curious what REAP is all about, this will give you a sense of what that is. What is REAP? REAP is a new solo tabletop role-playing game that I'm working on that's all about necromancy. You're a solo necromancer moving around the world, exploring these dangerous realms, hunting down horrors, reaping their souls, and empowering all of your spells and weapons. Um, it uses the system that I created for RUNE, which is heavily inspired by Souls-like games, so your Dark Souls, Elden Ring, Bloodborne, things like that, to capture that environmental storytelling that we see in like point crawl format with intense, deadly tactical combat in a grid setting. REAP borrows heavily from RUNE in terms of its rule structure, but there are some important changes, and that's what this video is here to show off. So I want to kind of focus on those changes in terms of exploration, combat, and characters. So in terms of exploration, there's kind of basically two big changes to take note of. And one thing I should note before I go into any of this stuff is that REAP is still in development right now. It will be kickstarted soon. There will be links to all of that stuff down below. So any of the stuff that you're seeing right now is probably how REAP is going to turn out, but there might be some changes between this video and its final release. But this should give you a good sense of what these changes are. Okay, back to the changes. Exploration. Two big things that are changing. First things first, we're removing the death penalty. The death penalty element that was in RUNE was one that if your character died while they were out exploring or fighting enemies, which happened a lot, realms would have specific penalties that your character would take on that oftentimes were pretty horrible. They would be intense debuffs that would make your next fight even harder to start off with. You would lose access to weapons or actions and things like that. And it kind of created this death spiral situation. There were situations where I was playing RUNE and I would die in combat, and then the penalty that I took on was so intense that I would just inevitably die again and again and again and again. That there was no way to escape it, and then I either had to just like abandon that realm or just kind of fudge it and skip taking on the death penalty, which is what I did more often than not. And so, after kind of talking about that penalty with some other fellow designers who are interested in RUNE, it was decided that we just don't need it. It doesn't need to be a part of the game, so it's been taken out. The more interesting element that's been added to exploration is the vessel. So there's still a realm clock in REAP, which is sort of a clock that is you are racing against in order to avoid horrible things happening in the realms that you are exploring. But on top of that, you have your own clock that you are filling up called your vessel. Each realm has its own designed unique vessel that is essentially a source for holding the soul of the horrible big bad boss that's inside that realm. And you need to attune it in order to be able to reap that soul. And reaping the boss's soul is a really important part of character advancement and getting the best possible loot, so you're going to want to fill the vessel. Every time you start a new realm, you're going to see what that vessel is requiring of you. And as you mark in that vessel based off of hitting those requirements, when you do face the boss, if your vessel has been filled in, fully attuned, you're going to get that boss's soul, which is going to be really important for advancement, which we'll talk about a little bit later. For example, here's the Kyrie vessel that is part of the sample realm that you can find in the free REAP Kickstarter or Quick Start right now. As you can see, it's a 6-segment clock, and you mark it anytime you win a fight, and that's a repeatable thing. So if you win a bunch of fights, cool, that fills the vessel. You learn the horror's name. So I've added in elements with the vessel where it leans into that storytelling thing. Now, like going out and getting lore and learning things about the world matters a little bit more mechanically. That's exciting to me to like know that you are able to take this horror's soul more easily because you know its name, right? You know the true name of something, you can take it. If you reach lore 2+, right? Again, encouraging characters to go do that learn action so that there's a mechanical benefit to it. And then if at any point you have 5 or more components carried on you, we'll talk a little bit more about components in a little bit. But it's a way of showing like you need to kind of bulk up before you take on this boss. If at any point doing all of those things fills in the vessel, you're really ready to take on the boss. I think the vessel is a cool way to sort of like have your own clock that you're racing against along with the realm clock, because there will be times when you're playing the game where you will not want to prioritize the vessel, where the realm clock is so punishing that you might have to abandon filling the vessel just so you don't take the big penalties from the realm. Or you say, I'll take these big hits because I really want to get the soul from that boss at the end of it. I think it just makes exploration a little bit more interesting, so I'm really happy with this vessel. The combat changes, there's actually some pretty substantial ones that are going on here. It will still feel like familiar turn-based combat that we see in Rune, where you're going to be rolling dice for enemies, rolling your own dice and assigning them to see what enemies are going to do, and assigning them to your own weapons to see what you're going to do. But there's some like really important changes that I think are going to expand the scope and feel of combat. First things first, as you can see, we're moving to a 5x5 grid. It's a little bit bigger. Honestly, adding one row and column is a substantial amount of change, so you get a lot more space there. That's really, really helpful to us. So this is going to allow creating more interesting scenes. It's going to allow putting more enemies on the map. But importantly, movement and space and things like that are going to matter more in combat, because you're going to be a necromancer, so you're going to have a lot of actual ranged spells. It's going to be a big component for you, is to like stay away from the enemies and blast them with all of your cool powers from afar. And on top of that, the battlefield is going to get a little complicated, not only from terrain, but because the corpses of enemies stay on the field when they die. In Rune, they would just get removed, but they have to stay there because you can take things from them. And that's what the kind of the next thing I want to talk about. The new turn order, which leads to sort of this reaping cycle that is in the game Reap, is really exciting to me. The new turn order, again, the game largely functions the same way as Rune. You're going to roll dice for the enemies, see what they're going to do, move them around. Then you're going to roll your dice and assign them to your spells and weapons. But unlike Rune, where you would then move and deal your harm at the same time as the enemy, so it was kind of, you're figuring out when the trade-offs are, you get to do all of your stuff before the enemies do their harm actions. So you get to assign dice to a spell, fully resolve that spell, assign your other die to a different spell, fully resolve that spell, and then you're done. And if the enemies can hit you from where you are at the end of that, you take on that harm. What is that change all about? It's about making you more powerful. Rune was very much designed to mimic that Souls-like experience, that dangerous, lethal component to things. Reap has elements of that, but you're not nearly as like open to death in Reap. You're a necromancer. You control death. And so to me, I wanted you to feel more powerful, and allowing you to really get these super cool like spell combos where you fully resolve one thing and then realize that it opens up to doing a totally different thing with your other spell. That was more exciting to me. And so we created a sort of a new combat system where you get to do all of your stuff, and then you take on the hits from the enemies if you've left yourself vulnerable. At the very end of each round of combat, you have the opportunity to reap. Like I said, if any of these enemies die in combat, their corpses stay on the map. If you are either adjacent or on the same space of a corpse at the end of your round, you get to reap components from it. The corpse finally gets removed from the map, and then you take something from them. I've put an example here. None of these layouts are finalized, but this is a cultist, for example. And the cultist is a great enemy to fight because you can choose literally any of the 3 major components that are in the game whenever you kill them. So you kill a cultist and you can take either body, bone, or blood. And these components are really important because you're using them to amplify and make your spells more powerful. So at the end of a round, you reap whatever components you can, corpses get taken away, and now you have all these components to make yourself even more powerful. For example, here's a couple of spells that you might have, like Summon Skeleton or the Spectral Step. With the Summon Skeleton, you can see that if you spend a body component when you activate this, that skeleton that you're summoning has a little bit more health than it normally would. Or if you spend bone when you activate the Summon Skeleton spell, you can either decide to give that skeleton a little bit more health, not as much as the body, but you could also instead give it a little bit more harm. So now you've got this little minion, and you're deciding what components you're going to infuse into it, if any, when you create it. You don't have to put any components into the spell, but it makes it more powerful. There are other ways, though, that spells can be changed by components. It's not always just this amplifying thing. Sometimes it will give you completely new options for the spell. So the Spectral Step has a particular effect when you roll 3 to 5. However, If you spend a body and you have a 1, which is normally a die roll that you can't really spend, it doesn't really do much for you. Now suddenly the Spectral Step is giving you a totally new power that you didn't have before, and you're using that 1, which was probably a dead die for you before. So now we're using these spell components to give you the opportunity to change the way that the spells function entirely, amplify them in new ways. Again, it's all about creating interesting turns for you, deciding what's the best possible way that I can use the combination of weapons and spells and components that I have to devastate the enemies that are on the board right now. It continues to lean into that concept of combat as a puzzle, and I think it makes combat an even more interesting puzzle when we add this element of components and really customizing the way that you want your spells to work. So this kind of leads to the last thing that I wanted to talk about is, what does your character look like? Again, you look very similar to a RUNE character. You have health, a stamina, and lore, the same sort of main stats that we see in RUNE. You also have blood, body, and bone, which you carry around with you, the components that you take from bodies. And then in terms of what your character can carry, every Reaper in the game carries 2 spells and 1 weapon. So this is where the sort of the build component of the game starts to come to shape. What kind of spells do you want? And how can you choose a weapon that's going to enhance those spells? Typically, spells are not giving you a lot of movement. And if you've played RUNE before, you know how important movement is. And so your weapon is going to be the thing that's going to be affording you a lot of movement. Unless you decide to choose a different weapon and grab a spell that's a really movement focused sort of thing. You get to prioritize what's most important to you in Reap in terms of the playstyle you want. And so that's that kind of like expanded loadout by having 3 things that you can assign dice to, yet you're still only rolling 2 dice. Just again, gives you more ideas about, or more options for what you can do in combat than just, here are my 2 weapons, I'm rolling 2 dice, I'm probably assigning them to these 2 things. Now you got a little bit more going on. On top of that, you have this 4th thing, which is the Relic. The Relic is kind of the core of your build. I'm really happy with this concept of the Relic. It is a thing that you choose, and there will be lots of different relics in the game. And the Relic is essentially the thing that determines what your build is all about. Because the Relic is something that you can spend your components on at any time during combat to gain an immediate benefit from. Here's the really simple beginner Relic. So this one isn't designed necessarily to push you towards a particular build. It's just there as a simple example. So for example, with the Neophyte's Tome, you could spend a bone at any time to gain block, right? So now you suddenly have the ability to get some block. Maybe you pull off a spell combo, but realize you're vulnerable to taking some damage at the end of the round, but you have a little bone left over. Just spend it real quickly and grab some block so you reduce that harm that you take. Or spend some body to get some more movement. Maybe you can't exactly get the positioning you want with how you've assigned the dice, but if you could move one more space, it'll get you there. Spend the body to do it. Or if you're taking a beating and you don't want to die anytime soon, you can maybe consume some blood and gain some of that health back. Relics will be tuned towards particular play styles. So for example, there will be future relics that will have like almost entirely all effects based off of spending blood or body or bone. And in those sorts of instances, you're going to be looking for these spells that are about generating or gathering bone as best you can. There will be spells and weapons and things like that that convert components from one to the next, right? So if you're going for sort of like a bone mancer build, right, you're going to want a relic that's going to be all about allowing you to maximize spending bone or generating bone as best as possible. You're going to want things like this summon skeleton thing, right, where you can build a more powerful skeleton, and other weapons and spells that will kind of lean in that direction, or a blood mancer, or like a weird body mancer, right? The Relic, I think, is kind of the heart and soul of what your character is going to be all about. It gives you that build. It gives you that kind of that core distinguishing feature of what your character is all about. And it's just something that you can constantly rely on in combat that can give you that slight edge when you can't exactly pull off the combo that you want to pull off. The last thing that I want to talk about here is what character advancement looks like. In RUNE, character advancement comes in 2 forms. It's getting new loot, and that's absolutely a component of Reap, is getting new access to new weapons, relics, and spells. And then also in RUNE, it's getting access to runes, the things that you would take from bosses. every time you killed a boss in Rune, you would get this rune, a specially crafted little bonus that was really helpful. You could hold 3 of them as a character, and so you kind of, this was part of how you made your build in Rune, is deciding what you prioritize based off of the runes that you had collected. I really like it. I think it fits really well with the theme of Rune. But I wanted to do something different with Reap. And so the bosses in Reap don't give you a thing. They don't give you a new, like, special rune-like thing. They'll give you loot for sure. Every time you kill a boss, you're gonna get a piece of loot. And that's an important thing to remember. Because as you're racing against that realm clock, even if that clock is filling up, if you eventually kill that boss, you're gonna get some cool piece of loot. Spell, weapon, or relic of some kind. But what you really want is the boss's soul. And you can only do that if you fully attune the vessel. If you fully attune your vessel and kill the boss, you get a soul, which is not actually like a card. It's not a thing that, it's not a weapon, it's not a power or anything like that. But instead, you can imbue souls into your weapons and spells and things like that to make them more powerful. Which means every spell and weapon in the game will have sort of multiple levels to them, that you can bind these souls to particular spells or bind them to your weapons to make those really powerful. So if you're focusing on a build and you love the spike spell, for example, which allows you to just kind of like summon some spikes out of the ground and really mess with people, and it's about spending bone to make that happen. This is just an example, but for example, the spikes +1 might look something like this, where if you imbue one of those valuable boss souls into it, the harm and everything is staying the same for spikes, but now suddenly you have the ability to get some movement out of it. Movement is so like invaluable in Rune and in Reap, and again, not something that you typically see in the spell section of the equipment that you have. That spikes +1 or whatever we ultimately decide to call these sort of soul empowered weapons and spells is might be a thing that you do. And once you've done that, now you might want to keep leveling it up if there's the opportunity to, or you've decided this is as maxed out as you want to go. What other things can you do now and find to like best match with this thing? I think I like this idea of empowering the weapons that you find by binding souls. There's already a lot going on for you between the 2 spells, the weapon, and the relic, and all the components. I thought if we add something like runes that are in Rune, there's just too many things for you to have to keep track of in combat. But by keeping it to the 3 things that you can assign dice to, the 1 thing that you can always spend your components on, and now you're just making the things that you already have even more powerful, I think that makes advancement more interesting and keeps it at a level where you're not going to be overwhelmed while you're doing it. I think also, this is a really simple example that's on the screen, but I'm imagining scenarios in which some of these spells and weapons get totally new powers or totally new effects as you imbue them, right? So a sword could be a really mundane sword until you imbue it with one of these powerful souls. And now it's going to do some sort of crazy, like, big AoE effect, or it drains the life from enemies every time you kill it because you've imbued it with the power of this incredibly big, scary being. So that's all the stuff that is sort of new in Reap, or at least a taste of some of the things that you should expect in this new version of the Rune system. I'm really excited about it. I hope you're excited about it too. There's links down below where you can find everything in terms of links for the Kickstarter or the Quick Start or the official game if you're watching this after the game has come out. I hope you enjoy this, and if you have any questions about Rune or want to know more about it, drop comments down below. I'll talk to you later. Bye.